So today we are looking at a 2021 study in the European Children's Adolescence Psychiatry Journal, and it is on emotional regulation and tic disorders in children. So this is a 2021 study, and we're going to go all the way back to the magnesium study from 2009. So that is an old study. You know, you're looking at a 12, 13-year-old study when we're looking at those magnesium studies. So, and you also have to understand that there's actually very little in the world of studying tics and Tourette's in children. There's not a lot of it. But we're going to break all of that down. So today we're going to talk about this 2021 study about emotional regulation in children with tic disorders. So this particular study looked at 60 admissions, 60. So you have to look at, okay, this sample size group is really small. And sometimes the Tourette's Association won't even look at studies that have this small of a sample size. So like the sample size of the food study, gluten and dairy study that was done, the Tourette's Association wouldn't even look at it because they didn't feel like there was enough people in that study, even though there was super positive changes for those people. So you have to understand how studies are looked at, how they're analyzed, and then how that data is actually used. And before I dig into this, the other thing I want to point out is that studies that are done now, so this is a 2021 study, that these studies are really not incorporated into medical education for about 30 years. And that's if these studies are found to be beneficial, like something that they want to teach. So if your doctor graduated medical school 30 years ago, he's already 30 years behind. The guy is 60 years behind because what is taught in medical school is about 30 years old. We are using very, very old data. So you think about how long it takes you to write a medical textbook, how long it takes to get that textbook edited and approved, how long it takes to actually get the professors to teach it in medical school. You have to understand that it's about 30 years before any of these studies actually hit mainstream medical school. So for me, as a holistic natural provider, it is really important for me to look at these studies all the time. I get an email every single week with all of the studies, and I look at those studies and I read those studies and I break those studies down. So I want you to have an understanding of what I'm looking at as far as the science and the data goes. I'm looking at the current. I'm not looking at the 30-year-old. All right, let's roll. So out of 60 consecutive admissions, so this was 60 children that were assessed, this was at a psychiatric hospital. These kids also had tic disorders. They were assessed for emotional dysregulation, I can't speak, severity of obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, tic expression, and this is all done at a tic disorders clinic in a university affiliated pediatric hospital. So the results indicated, so of these 60 admissions, of all of these kids who had comorbidities. So comorbidities are, for those people that don't really understand, it means that you have one or more diagnoses. You've gone to the doctor and you've got this diagnosis of tic disorder and obsessive compulsive, tic disorder and anxiety, tic disorder, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive. You have comorbidities. You have multiple diagnoses. So what they found is the results indicated that stress and emotional dysregulation were significantly related to tic expression and severity of those comorbidities. So these kids that were experiencing the stress had higher levels of tics and higher severity of those comorbidities. So maybe more of those OCD tendencies. This is what the study found. Okay, great. That's really good information. But here's where we want to talk about, what is this study missing? What is missing? We have this information that, okay, that stress and emotional dysregulation were significantly related, but what is it missing? So one, we have to look at those stressors that go beyond emotional stress. This study really gets me because it really only looks at emotional stress. Many of you have heard me say that those 4 major triggers for tic disorders are all caused by stress. But there are 4 different types of stress. So one is that emotional stress. We are emotional. We are emotional beings. But we also have to look at what is that environmental stress? What are those outside influences that are causing stress? Are there toxins? Are you cleaning your house with bleach and pine sol? Do you live next to a coal plant? Like, what are, a refinery? Like, what are those outside influences? I saw a lot of kids during COVID who were seeing an increase in symptoms because bleach, 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 Clorox wipes everywhere. They are toxic chemicals that your kids are very, very sensitive to. So when we're looking at that one, we have to look at, well, what is going on in your environment that might be causing stress? And when we talk about environmental stress, your environment can also cause that emotional stress. So looking at the fact that, like, I work with a lot of overwhelmed, panicked moms. And your children, anxious moms create anxious children. Those children, I shouldn't say yours, but those particular children have a harder time with this emotional regulation. They see more dysregulation because mom is super anxious and she's high alert and she's in her own state of fight or flight. Because remember that all of these kids are experiencing these tics are in a state of fight or flight. They're in this overstressed state. One, we have to look at the environment. What are all of those environmental factors? Next, we have to look at the physical factors because physical stress can play a role. Is your kid sitting on their butt all day? Then they don't want to go outside. They're not getting the sunlight they need. Do they sit around playing a bunch of video games? Do they maybe have some misalignment? If there's some chiropractic issues that maybe need to be addressed? So we have to look at what are those physical things as well, those physical stressors. And then we have to look at biological stressors. This study indicates stress and emotional dysregulation are significantly related. But we're only looking at emotional stress. We're not looking at these other stressors. So let's take a look at biological stress. What is biological stress? Biological stress is this internal stress. So you've got to consider, hey, there's food sensitivities, there's leaky gut, there's underlying infections, there's endotoxins. So you have exotoxins, these toxins on the outside. But did you know that your body makes toxins on the inside? So if you have, fungal overgrowth or mold or something like that, that is going to create its own toxins inside your body. You get endotoxins. So you have these biological stressors that are working from the inside out. So we have to look at what is causing emotional dysregulation. So we have to talk about stress, these stressors, emotional, environmental, physical, biological. These were not talked about in the study. This is what the study is missing, in my opinion. We have to take those stressors and then look at the influence on inflammation. When we see emotional dysregulation, so tell me this, does your child have good days and bad days? So what does that mean? That means that inflammation is a driver. If you have good days and bad days, there are days where you have higher inflammation. It is impacting the brain. It is impacting the neurotransmitters. It is impacting mood. There is this inflammation. Well, what's driving the inflammation? Emotional, environmental, physical, biological. Driving this inflammation. Inflammation is a natural part of your immune system. It's meant to, I have a kid at the trainer this morning. You fall, you twist your ankle, it gets red and swollen. That's your body's response. It's supposed to happen, but we are not supposed to have underlying inflammation all the time. So if you have good days and bad days, that real driver is from inflammation. And we can look at the PET scans, those PET scans of the brain of people who have mood disorders. And when they have these manic disorders, you can see higher inflammation in the brain. So we know that, it's not really neurotransmitter based, it's inflammation based. We cannot degrade neurotransmitters that quickly. So if you have good days and bad days, you're looking at inflammation. So we've taken this study and we've said, okay, stress and emotional dysregulation are significantly related to tic expression and the severity of those comorbidities. So those symptoms, are they up and down? What are those stressors? emotional, environmental, physical, biological. What are those stressors? And how are they driving that inflammation? How are they impacting the mood? So we have to talk about, is it really the emotions that are impacting the symptoms? Or is it the underlying stressors driving the inflammation, which in turn is driving those elevated emotions and symptoms? So I can tell you just in my own clinical experience and working with, the hundreds of clients around the world that I've worked with and my own son, is that those hidden stressors, that inflammation is a huge driver of the tic expression and the comorbidity. So a lot of you may have seen me talk about your child is stuck in a state of fight or flight. So we have to consider that their little bodies are stuck in the state of fight or flight. A lot of times I have a lot of moms who are also stuck in this state because they're very overwhelmed and emotional about what is happening with their child. So when I'm looking at studies, I'm going to break down, well, what is this study saying? And then how does that relate to what's actually going on with these kids and their life, their diet, their lifestyle, their bodies? How does that all go together? So I can look at these studies and say, well, this is a great study. I can see where these things, the stress and the emotional dysregulation and symptoms, are connected. But beyond that, what is missing from this study? What is driving the emotions and what is driving the inflammation?